Welcome to Malden and Schmidt, the Sustainable Motoring Podcast. In this episode, we're going nuclear. Could nuclear power be the key to sustainable motoring? I don't mean nuclear-powered cars, of course, but what I mean is, could a massive expansion of nuclear power provide lots of cheap electricity that could be used to generate synthetic fuels? These fuels could be used in normal engines, petrol, diesel, without having to rip them out and replace them with electric motors and batteries. This would potentially make decarbonising motoring much easier, would certainly provide an alternative path from the current orthodoxy. So far, so logical, but in reality, it's far from straightforward, which we'll discuss in this episode. I'm Nick Malden. I'm founder and chief executive of Emissions Analytics. We're an independent real-world testing company. And with me, as ever, is Oliver Schmidt. Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, my name is Oliver Schmidt. I've been working in the automotive industry for more than 25 years by now. But of course, most people know me by my involvement in the Volkswagen Dieselgate.
Our special guest today is someone who really knows his nuclear onions. Dr Tim Gregory is a nuclear chemist at Sellafield, the world's first commercial reactor, which was called Calder Hall. He's the author of a new book, which has had rave reviews, called Going Nuclear: How the Atom Will Save the World. Before we look at the motoring angle, Tim, and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to dive straight in, because what we like to do, we like to get straight to the point and tackle these issues in a very succinct fashion. But before we get into that motoring angle, your thesis sort of strongly implies that nuclear is the only realistic route to net zero by 2050.
Yes, it's more than implied. I think that's definitely true. And I think, 15 years ago, this would have been an incredibly difficult sell. But as we progress further towards our mid-century net zero deadlines, reality is dawning, the penny is dropping, and actually governments around the world are coming to the same mindset too.
And would you say that governments are more bought into it than they're admitting publicly? Because I see in the UK projections, they're assuming a quintupling of nuclear power output by 2050, which entails building quite a significant expansion. But that is not being trumpeted from the rooftops. We're simply talking about Hinkley C and what seems like relatively modest expansion.
Okay,
why are they not trumpeting such a big expansion?
So we're currently at about 6 gigawatts, and the previous Conservative government put in a target of up to 24 gigawatts. Now, the devil is in the detail of that. It's up to 24 gigawatts, which obviously includes anything from 0 to 24. And so whether or not we'll get to 24 gigawatts by 2050 is yet to be seen. But the recent announcement of Sizewell C, a 3.2 gigawatt nuclear power station down in Suffolk, which is enormous, even for a nuclear power station, is certainly a positive sign, I think.
And it seems to me that there are two approaches. You've got the current orthodoxy, which is driven by intermittent renewables, where you could see a world where there was so many wind turbines that you had loads of surplus electricity on windy days that you could make synthetic fuels from that. The alternative is you go for lots of baseload nuclear, and you would generate also big surpluses on low demand days. Which of those two do you think is the most practical way of producing lots of synthetic fuels, if it's possible at all?
I don't know why you would set up an energy system that relies mostly on intermittent power sources. No one has ever done that before, but people have made energy systems that are largely reliant on nuclear power. And so France is the perfect example of this. In 2005, and a couple of years either side, France derived 80%, that's 80% of its electricity from nuclear alone. And its economy during that time flourished. Its living standards didn't decline. And that meant that 80% of its electricity supply was carbon-free. And that was before anyone really cared about climate change and before anyone had even coined the phrase net zero. There's actually precedent for this. It's been done before. And given that there are lots of advanced economies now that have, a couple of tens of percent of intermittent wind and solar in their grids, why not make up the rest using nuclear? And people often ask me, what would your perfect grid composition be? And of course, it differs from country to country, and there's a big element of sort of sticking your finger in the air and seeing which direction the wind is blowing or not. But I would say, why not have something like 75% nuclear and 25% renewables? Something like that. It's actually been done almost before in France in 2005, plus or minus a couple of years.
And aren't we actually, even today, more dependent on nuclear than the headline figures suggest? Because it seems to be most days we import 10 to 15% of our electricity from France, which is mostly nuclear.
And it's very interesting when you look at Europe's electricity system as a whole. Nuclear is the single biggest source of emissions-free power. It's actually more than wind and solar put together, although that will likely change either this year or next as wind and solar combined just about overtake it. But it's a fact that's astonishing to most people that nuclear is already such a massive part of the European energy system. But that's kind of the point. The fact it's astonishing is quite telling because it's just happened without anybody realising it. It just quietly gets on in the background doing what it does, which is reliably producing power without the detriment to the natural environment.
At this point, I wanted to bring in Oliver because you mentioned a European power system. Oliver lives in Germany, is at the centre of your largest country in Europe, of course, and is still a consumer of nuclear power through how it imports from neighbouring countries, but won't officially have anything to do with nuclear power. Do either of you, and I'll come to Oliver first, but then Tim for your view, is there any scenario at all in which Germany can be persuaded of the benefits of nuclear power, or is that just so far gone that Germany might take a completely different path from everyone else in Europe? Oliver, is there any scenario at all people could be persuaded?
So with the current government that we have, I don't see any chance there. The current government is exactly the government that decided to ban nuclear or to shut down all nuclear plants and not follow the nuclear path after Fukushima. It's the same people in charge. It's a big coalition out of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. So I don't see it in that composition that nuclear will come back. There are parties that support nuclear. Unfortunately, one of them is the right-wing party that nobody wants at the reign, but they are the ones heavily supporting it. And also our Free Democrats support it, but they basically got their not their bill, they got their results from what they have done so far in the last election. I think they got 3% or something like this, so they don't play any role anymore. So I don't see it in the current system that it's going to happen. So everybody was so afraid after Fukushima, and this led really to the demise of the German nuclear plants. I know that after the war with Ukraine started, that Germany had a few nuclear power plants running for 3 months or a year longer, but that was it. So now they are officially all switched off. And we are still searching where to get all the debris from the ones we are dismantling. So I live here in an area in Germany where all the storage facilities are. There is one storage facility about 50 kilometers from here. They are now digging everything up to bring it back up because all the metal containers they use, they are corroded through by now, and the nuclear waste is escaping. So I don't see it coming back with all the fear of the negative effects that nuclear can have. So that's
Germany
the official.
Germany, though, has got an economic crisis at the moment, particularly in manufacturing, and France enjoys a competitive advantage of lower commercial electricity prices because of its nuclear. I have a feeling that Germany could just be tempted by the sheer economic necessity of it. That's my theory. Difficult, but possible. But Tim,
of course.
Tim, is that possible?
I think it's possible, and I think it's not just the kind of the stick approach when economic reality dawns, and I hope I'm wrong, but if, there are widespread blackouts across Germany, I think that might make people think twice, but more positively than that, and I do think this is a better motivator, other European countries, Germany's neighbours, will provide positive examples of what is possible when you implement a good nuclear programme. So Finland is a nice example of that. Sweden, another nice example. The UK even, and of course France. But there are lots of other European countries that have great nuclear power programs, and lots of them want to expand going through the rest of the 21st century as well. And so, political ideologies come and go, trends come and go. Although things might look bleak now for Germany on the energy front, there's no reason why things can't change for the better quickly sometimes.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm just naive.
As I said, it's the current political opinion here. It's not my personal opinion. It's the current political opinion here. But even there, so we had this big first fight in the new coalition about the taxation of power for companies. So they reduced the taxation for the power for companies, and they during their campaigns they promised, we do it for everybody, and every company gets cheaper electricity now. But then they realized that it's of course tax revenue they are losing. So they basically reduced the taxation on the energy, and they now only do it for the big companies. So that's the problem. The big problem we have with France is that they build all their power plants at the same time, and they always go in service at the same time. So you have this up and down in France with the nuclear power. They have, for a long period, they have a surplus, and then all these power plants need to go into maintenance and service. And then you see France buying electricity from everywhere else. So I think this is something they need to realize. They need to spread out their maintenance a bit better over their power plants. So,
Which brings us, the important topic we need to move on to rapidly is the question of cost, Tim. And here in the UK, we are repeatedly told by our current Secretary of State for Energy that wind renewables are 5 times cheaper than traditional sources, and also that nuclear, we're told, is very expensive. The guaranteed per megawatt hour prices, are always reported in the press as very high. It seems to be actually, and reading of it, that the absolute opposite is true when you look at it at a system level, and if you did nuclear at significant scale. Is that a correct interpretation? And what needs to be achieved to get the price of nuclear down?
Yeah, you've got it right in essence. So often when people claim that wind and solar are incredibly cheap and getting cheaper all the time, what they're talking about is the levelized cost of electricity. And it's a very simple calculation to perform. You look at the price of a solar panel or a wind turbine or a gas power station or a nuclear power station for that matter, and you divide that cost by how many megawatt hours of electricity that particular piece of infrastructure will make over its lifetime. And so you get a cost per megawatt hour. And when you look at the numbers using the levelized cost of electricity, indeed, wind and solar are incredibly cheap. But the point of a power source is not simply just to produce electricity. It's to produce electricity where you need it, when you need it, and crucially in the quantities that you need it. And so when you factor in all of these system costs, whether it be the vast amounts of transmission you need to gather up all of that dispersed and dilute wind power, when you factor in the pumped hydro stations that you need to maintain and build, or the grid-scale batteries that people are touting, when you factor in all of the different pieces of infrastructure you need to manage and successfully run a fluctuating grid, the picture becomes much more complicated, and there's a whole academic field of study dedicated to estimating these costs, because in reality it's just not a very simple calculation that you can easily get across to, say, a politician or a media outlet. But when you do these calculations, that you see the same trend all of the time. The cost of wind and solar skyrockets and the wind of nuclear plummets. And part of the reason why the cost of nuclear plummets is the longevity of a nuclear power station. Yep. Remember I said that nuclear is already Europe's biggest source of emissions-free power. That's even more astonishing given that we've barely built any new nuclear power stations since the late 1980s after Chernobyl. Basically, all of Europe's nuclear infrastructure is a legacy of the 1970s and the 1980s, and it's still churning out massive amounts of emission-free electricity. And there are some reactors now in the USA that have had their licenses extended beyond 60 years, up to 80 years. And there's really no reason why some of those shouldn't go on to become centennials one day. And so the massive upfront cost of a nuclear power station is enormously diluted by the sheer quantity of electricity that it generates reliably and the amount of time that it generates that electricity for. Now, there's no getting away from the fact that nuclear power is incredibly expensive in Europe and North America at the moment. And part of the reason for that is because we're basically starting from scratch again. If you look at Hinkley Point C, it's already overdue and it's massively over budget. But the UK is basically starting a nuclear power programme again. The last nuclear reactor that we connected to the grid was in 1995, and that was Sizewell B. I was 18 months old then. And so it was like several generations ago. Okay, so we're kind of starting from scratch. And when you look further east into Asia, costs have actually fallen in South Korea and China over the last couple of decades. And so this idea that nuclear is inherently incredibly expensive is simply not true. And I'll just finish as well by just one really important point, that it does seem that in the West loosely in general at the moment, we just can't seem to deliver massive pieces of infrastructure like we used to. They all seem to get delayed and they all seem to run over budget, whether it be new hospitals, housing estates, high-speed rail networks, even potholes in our road network. We just can't seem to deliver these big pieces of infrastructure. Nuclear gets caught up in that. It is not a problem with nuclear per se. It's a wider phenomenon that nuclear gets caught up in.
Yeah, so it's like never trust a number if you haven't falsified it yourself. I think that's the rule here that Tim basically explained. So I see this here in Germany. So nuclear is the highest cost power source, the highest by far, because all the dismantling of I don't know how many nuclear power plants at the same time is now put into this cost. So we had, like you described, we dismantled all nuclear power plants. They were 40, 50, some 30 years old, but they all get dismantled now at the same time. And so all the dismantling cost now gets added to the former production of power in those nuclear power plants. And so basically, so if they could, they would still invoice us now for the rising cost of nuclear. So this is really, if you can't extend the life, or if you don't get a proper solution for the waste, then nuclear is not competitive. In my perspective, this would be the first you need to solve, is the waste and the longevity. And of course, the safety combined to the longevity.
As for the cost breakdown, the vast majority of the cost is in the upfront cost of building the power station. Once they're built, they're actually quite cheap to run. And even the cost of decommissioning them and dismantling them and managing the waste is not actually that expensive compared to building the power station. And as for the solution for nuclear waste, Finland has designed one and implemented one. It was 40 years ago that Finland decided that it was going to bury its nuclear waste underground in a geological repository. The idea being that because nuclear waste is radioactive, over time its radioactivity will diminish, it decays away. And so eventually it just won't be nuclear waste anymore. It will simply be waste. How long do you have to leave it underground? It's something like 1 million years, which sounds like a long time, but it's actually the blink of an eye geologically. And just last year, Finland opened the world's first and still only geological repository for nuclear waste. It's called Onkalo. And it's really important to note that it took 40 years for them to get it through government, to win the public over, to find a suitable site and to build it and to implement it, but they've done it. And there's about a dozen other countries around the world, many of them in Europe, currently looking for where to situate their own geological repositories. Yeah. And so there is no nuclear waste problem. It's already been solved, and Finland have shown how to do it.
So if we did nuclear power at real scale, we did what the French did in the 70s and more, and we did that across Europe with an integrated European supply chain with America as well, potentially. So the world genuinely did nuclear at scale. How low could the unit cost of electricity produced get?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't think anybody could really honestly answer that question precisely, because it depends so much on the local composition of the grid and the energy demands of that particular nation. And so that's just not a question that I can answer. However, there's a really interesting data set where you can plot the share of nuclear in a country's grid versus the cost of electricity for consumers and industrially. And if you believe this trope that nuclear makes electricity incredibly expensive, you would expect a straight line relationship sloping upwards. And it's just simply not the case. And France, which gets as a share of its total electricity It's got more nuclear in its grid than any other country, has actually got cheaper electricity than the European Union average. And so it depends too much country to country and exactly how they price electricity and how their energy market works.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty simple. You can set a target. You look at China. We know that China is talking about, or the prices there are around 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is the target where you need to be competitive for the industry. That's what I would say. Just put out a target where you need to come out, and China is setting that target.
It seems that that there is definitely a possibility for massively scaling nuclear, and it could drive the unit cost down substantially. But tell us about, just in terms of some of the basic mechanics of how you actually build a nuclear power station, and whether these small modular reactors, these factory produced components, do they give a potential avenue for practicality and also breaking down local opposition?
Sure. So at its simplest, a nuclear power station is essentially a giant kettle. The whole name of the game is to generate steam that turns a turbine. And how you generate that steam depends on whether it's a fossil fuel power station, gas or coal, or a nuclear power station where instead of setting the fuel on fire, you send it critical and you split the atoms in the uranium fuel. And so the whole name of the game of nuclear power is just to make hot water. Okay, that's it at their simplest. And so beyond that, they're not actually that much different to the traditional power stations that basically run society for the last, basically most of the century. They're not that different. The only difference is the fuel that they use and how they generate the heat. Now, they're typically about 1 gigawatt, okay, which is a huge amount of electricity. Hinkley Point C will be 3.2 gigawatts. Sizewell C will be 3.2, which is absolutely astronomical amounts of power from a single place. You wouldn't need many of them to run the entire grid in the UK. But one of the exciting things about the nuclear industry at the moment, and it's really encouraging to see the British government backing this technology as well, on both sides of the house, I should mention, are these small modular reactors. And as their name suggests, they're small. And the question is, how small do you want to go? These things are entirely scalable. There are designs for small modular reactors, and indeed these small reactors have actually been demonstrated and they work, that would easily fit under the computer desk before me. They're about the size of a microwave oven, and there's a little bit of peripheral infrastructure there to convert that heat into electricity, but they're incredibly small. There are designs that would fit into a shipping container, all the way up to kind of hundreds of megawatts, that would cover a land area equivalent to a couple of tennis courts. And so small modular reactors are scalable, but the really exciting part of this technology is the M part of the acronym, SMR, modular reactors. The idea being that you can build these reactors on a factory line, upwards of 85, 90, 95% of the reactor could be built on a factory line in pieces, much like you might buy furniture from IKEA in pieces and ship it back to your house in the back of a modest-sized car and assemble it in the afternoon. The same logic, hopefully, will apply to these small modular reactors. You can move them to where they need to be and click them together with minimal fuss. And if we've learned anything from industrialization, Ford, of course, invented the factory line. When you build things on a factory line, you bring the cost down and you bring the timescales down. No one has achieved this yet. This is new technology, or at least it's new in a civil sense, because we've been building small reactors on board nuclear submarines for decades now. So that bit's not new. But the small modular technology in a civil setting is new. And no country has yet achieved the dream of mass production. But I think it's just a matter of time until they do. And so it's likely that we'll have the first small modular reactor in the UK within the next 10 years. And I suspect after that, they'll start popping up here, there and everywhere. And already in North America, big tech have started buying small modular reactors to power their AI data centers, including Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Amazon. And so big tech is already there, and it's just a matter of time before government catches up.
Is there a certain size for a nuclear power plant where I get the best degree of efficiency? So like we know that for everything that you build, there is a certain size where you always get the best degree of efficiency. If you make it smaller, you lose efficiency. If you get bigger, your increase of efficiency is just marginal compared to the additional cost.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer, and I don't think we will know until we've at least started implementing this. The data are just not there to say either way. I will just say, however, that I think maybe one of the very small number of negative things about small modular reactors is that they might distract us from the traditional gigawatt nuclear power stations. I still think that we'll need those as well. But undoubtedly a grid supplemented by these small modular reactors in places that are hard to decarbonise, such as chemical plants, steel plants, food and drinks factories, paper mills, those kinds of things.
And how could we make these things really safe? That clearly is something that weighs on a lot of people's minds, not least in Germany. And if your vision of the success of the nuclear industry leads us to having plants and these SMRs dotted all around the country, everywhere, in towns, everywhere, in very large numbers, doesn't it just leave sitting targets for bad guys to go and try and blow up? What happens if you drop a bomb on Hinkley C, for example, in very simple terms?
Well, you could say that about all sorts of pieces of infrastructure, and maybe a natural example of someone dropping a bomb on a nuclear power station might be Chernobyl. Of course, nobody dropped a bomb on Chernobyl. It exploded because of operator incompetence and corruption in the Soviet Union. But the reactor did explode, and all of the surrounding buildings set on fire and lofted radioactive fallout into the sky for days before the Soviets kind of got their head around what had happened and started mitigating it. And when you look at the death toll of Chernobyl, maybe something like 35 people died, something like that, in the immediate aftermath. They were mostly first responders, people who were at the power plant at the time of the accident, and the firefighters who famously were some of the first on scene to put the fires out. And as for the wider deaths amongst the wider population, there's no way of knowing, of course, and so we have to statistically model it. And the only form of cancer where there was an increase in incidence following Chernobyl was thyroid cancer in people who were children and adolescents at the time of the accident. And when you combine those statistics with the survival rates of thyroid cancer, you can make estimates that something like a couple of hundred people will eventually die in total because of Chernobyl. And so that's not that many given the mythic reputation of the night in question. And that also means that when you look at the deaths per terawatt hour of electricity, nuclear is about on a par with wind and solar, and it's orders of magnitude safer than fossil fuels. In fact, more people die from fossil fuel related air pollution every couple of years than have ever died of nuclear power, ever. And so far from being this really risky technology that's really kind of reckless and full of hazards and is just kind of tempting fate, splitting atoms in nuclear power stations is one of the safest things that our species does, and it's way safer than setting things on fire.
But as that bomb drops on Hinkley C, how well buried is the core within it? And how much explosive power can it withstand before it actually leads to some runaway release like there was at Chernobyl?
So the reactor at Hinkley Point C is a European power reactor of French design, and they have a containment shell that can withstand an aeroplane. They've actually been aeroplane tested, so that's pretty good, and I think pretty reassuring, especially given the last 7 decades of nuclear power generation on Earth with its impeccable safety record.
The reason I wanted to dwell on that is because when we come to choosing our route to decarbonising transport, everything is driven by CO2 reduction, which is off the back of very lurid descriptions of what is likely to happen from climate change in terms of droughts and fires and uninhabitability of large parts of the globe, etc., and migration in large numbers of people. If you put a price on that, that is a really very, very, very large number, but it is spread out over quite a long period of time. It's also will often happen in places a bit far away that are not so visible. So we're trying to compare those sort of costs and benefits against a nuclear costs and benefits where you could have one very, very photographic event of something crashing into a nuclear power station, and human beings are not very good at assessing the risks and the payoffs. They will tend to put a higher weight on the things which are much more graphic and much more present to them. So it must be a challenge for you in terms of articulating those risks and costs around it. And so if one of the things that to what degree can nuclear genuinely put to bed the risks around it and evidence statistically how safe it is?
Look, nothing is perfectly safe. That's true of everything. And so in our own personal lives day to day and the way that we choose to set up our societies, we accept a certain level of risk for a trade-off and we decide collectively whether it's worth it or not. And so put it this way, more people would die if an aeroplane flew into my local hospital than died in Chernobyl. And yet we're not talking about getting rid of hospitals or burying them underground or putting them in massive containment shells. Talking of transport, we could reduce the global driving speeding limit to 5 miles per hour. It would essentially eliminate road deaths. Nobody would die on the roads, and a lot of people die on the roads every single day. And yet, collectively as a society, we decide it's kind of worth having the speed limit as what it is, tens of miles per hour in urban areas because of the societal benefits that we have, whether it just be pure convenience or making society tick with our trade routes and the transport of all of the infrastructure that we depend on. And so everything's about trade-offs. I would never claim that nuclear is perfectly safe, but the safety record of nuclear power speaks for itself. And it's kind of, don't just take my word for it. You can go and read the reports that outline in some detail the modelling and the historical record of the deaths from Chernobyl and Fukushima for that matter. None of them outline the deaths from 3 Mile Island because there were none. They're not included in the statistics because it says 0. So
I think the big problem is that people shouldn't mistake a nuclear bomb with a nuclear power plant.
For sure,
I think
really unfortunate.
This is the big issue here that Fukushima and Hiroshima sound so much alike. So I think that is the big issue here, to reassure people, whatever happens, a nuclear power plant cannot be a bomb. So I remember when I was a kid, when the atomic reactors were built here, they actually made those tests that you described. I remember that they dropped starfighters into concrete buildings to simulate the impact of a plane crashing into the nuclear power plant. So yeah.
Yes, it's really unfortunate that there's kind of this intermingling between the military applications of nuclear power, of course, with atomic bombs, and the civil applications of nuclear science with nuclear power. And whilst the two share a common origin, at least from the late 30s and through the 40s onwards with the Manhattan Project, the two are very, very different. And you're absolutely right. A nuclear reactor cannot explode like an atomic bomb because the uranium isn't enriched enough. Fukushima happened. It was a chemical explosion, not a nuclear explosion. And likewise with Chernobyl.
Okay, so beginning to bring the threads together and round this off. So nuclear and decarbonising transport are not two things that are often spoken in the same breath. And from the nuclear side, Tim, is anyone thinking along the lines, or is anyone in the nuclear industry being lined up or conceived as a major way of producing transportation fuel? Thinking not so cars, because everyone is so bought into the battery solution, but what about trucks, diggers, ships? Is the nuclear industry being engaged with a view to producing these alternative low carbon fuels?
It is, and just to set the context, transport is responsible for about 22% of global carbon emissions, which is enormous, and most of that is just everyday regular people jumping in their cars. And that's about 16% of global carbon emissions. And for context, aeroplanes are about 2.5%, which is amazing that they suffer the wrath of environmental activists so often when cars emit far more. Of course, there are more cars and there are more car miles every year than plane miles. But if you decarbonise everyday transport, you've gone a long way towards decarbonising the energy system. Now, whether or not we go down the synthetic fuel route, which I can talk about more maybe, or the electrification route, the fundamental problem is the same. You still need enormous quantities of electricity, and nuclear would be perfect for that. And so let's say we electrify regular domestic road transport for everyday people like me who just use their car for going to work and back occasionally, going to the shops and going to see family. to electrify that sector, you need enormous quantities of electricity, which is why the global electricity demand will double or triple by 2050, and I just can't see it coming down thereafter as we head towards the 22nd century. Nuclear power would be perfect for that. But of course, there are these other sectors within the transport sector, aeroplanes, ships, the big diggers that we use to gouge out mines and quarries, freight trains. It's very difficult to understand how we could electrify those just because of the sheer amount of energy that they need, and let alone the practicalities of having a battery-powered aeroplane. I think with the best will in the world, no one seriously thinks that that's going to happen with the convenience and the cost of current aviation as it is. I mean, I can get on a flight. It's cheaper for me to get to Barcelona than it is to get on a train to London. That's partly because the trains in the UK are so expensive, but also because the aviation industry have got so good at what they do that it's actually quite cheap to travel by aeroplane.
And this would be using nuclear to create liquid fuels that would drop into the existing powertrains.
That's right. That's right. And so there's this idea that you could make synthetic fuels using probably hydrogen as a base product, as a base ingredient to make those fuels. And then you could just replace the fuels that we dig out of the ground, almost like for like. I'm not sure that you could actually use the exact same engines with petrol slash diesel slash aviation fuel with synthetic. You can. Okay. So in that case, you wouldn't even need to replace the infrastructure. You would just replace the fuel. Now, to make synthetic fuel, crucially, you need a lot of electricity and you need a lot of heat as well. Both of those things are generated in abundance by nuclear reactors. And so I don't see any reason why, most of the hydrogen production in the world eventually isn't sated by nuclear power, because right now, hydrogen's dirty secret. And everyone talks about hydrogen as this lovely clean fuel of the future. It's clean at the point of use, but 99% of the hydrogen in the world is generated using fossil fuels as a base ingredient. That has to change, and nuclear power could do that.
Yeah, exactly. But it does come back to what we were talking about earlier, is that because of that vast amount of electricity required and heat to do that, it does need to be at a price that when you take into account all the inefficiencies in making it, you've obviously got to distribute it. And then when you burn it, if it is gasoline in an internal combustion engine, that's at less than 40% efficiency. Taking into account all those inefficiencies, can the original nuclear power be generated at a low enough price to make that work? And so that comes back to the scale question we were talking about. Can the nuclear industry exist at a scale that makes that possible?
I don't know whether or not we could ever get a litre of nuclear-derived petrol to be at the same price as a litre of petrol that we've got out of an oil well somewhere in the Middle East. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody does. But when it comes to realistic solutions to decarbonising these hard-to-reach sectors, we don't actually have that many options. And maybe it won't be nuclear. I don't know what the world is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. It might be that someone invents a super battery that's incredibly cheap and uses barely any lithium, barely any cobalt, barely any copper, and can actually store electricity at scale. That might happen, in which case, great. I'll start advocating for that. But right now, it seems to me that our best shot is nuclear, and we should at least try it with these hard-to-reach sectors that no one's ever attempted before.
Well, on that picture you paint, I'm going to ask to both of you to round off then, and maybe to illustrate the differences between Britain and Germany, is if you did go to the car forecourt to fill up your car with petrol, and you had an alternative, two pumps, one which is the standard stuff, and then you had nuclear-derived, zero-carbon petrol for the same price, say, but it was nuclear-derived. I think a UK consumer would go for that on the grounds of the environmental benefit. So question one to you, Tim, would you agree with that or take a different view? And then Oliver, in Germany, if you had the same scenario, Germany institutionally may be very anti-nuclear, but what do the real people on the ground feel? Tim, what do you think about UK first?
I agree with you, Nick. I think most people would take it. And when you look at the YouGov polls, which I do make a habit of tracking, 50% of people either strongly support or tend to support nuclear power. And strong opposition to nuclear power on the latest YouGov poll is at 8%. And so it's actually quite a minority view.
Okay, so what a vote yes in the UK? Oliver, Germany. What would it look like? Would the
So,
consumer go
so
for it?
the polls are in Germany are similar. So there is a huge support for nuclear power plants. Um, and the thing is, you already have this choice today, Nick. So it's not nuclear based, but if I have a diesel, I can go and fill it up with HVO. HVO is available. Okay, it's not made by nuclear, but it's something similar. It's an alternative fuel that is a little bit more expensive, that is nearly carbon neutral. So, and it's 7, 8, 10 cents more, and people just buy it. It's growing like
Yep.
crazy here. So I think the same would happen here. Of course, you will always have these people that need to look after their cents and that need to save money. They will always go for the cheapest. You will have always those people, but I think the majority would be there. And it's pretty easy. There is this the possibility of taxation. So we know that a liter of gasoline has, I don't know, €1 by now in taxation in it, or nearly €1. So, and the liter of every alternative fuel has exactly the same. So if the government would just take out a little bit out of the taxation and make it a bit more attractive to go for this fuel, make it 5, 4, 3, 2 cents cheaper than the other one, they will all take it. It's like E10 and E5. Everybody is getting E10 because it's 5 cents cheaper than E5. So everybody's doing it. So I would see
Yeah.
the same here. Just take a bit of taxation out of it.
And the HVO you mentioned, just for everyone's benefit, so that's a hydro-treated, effectively waste oils. It's one of the latest advanced biofuels, and which, to my knowledge, are available in a very small number of fill-up stations around Germany. Quite hard to find, but if you look for HVO
No, it's
100,
not.
I think,
No, it's not.
or is it for
It's
trucks?
not.
Is it
It's
for
not hard.
trucks only?
It's not. No, it's not for trucks only. It is the problem here in Germany was that until April last year, they didn't get government approval for it. So we were the latest coming to the party with HVO, but now it's growing tremendous. If you drive somewhere, I would say every third, fourth station by now already supports it. If they have an empty
Great.
pump, they support it.
Okay. Well, I think then we'll finish off there. And I mean, this obviously we could talk. And I think, Tim, it's fantastic that you've written this book now because, in a sense, we've been at a generational potential diversion thanks to Chernobyl, and we're coming back now to a real serious evaluation of the benefits of nuclear in the real world and looking at the real statistics rather than the emotions. I think what it does boil down to, though, in the end, is there'll be a choice coming. As you've alluded to, we'll probably never get a litre of petrol, nuclear derived, down to exactly the same level as fossil fuels. Ultimately, these fossil fuels, they just ooze out of the ground too cheaply. The competition is so stiff. But we might be able to get quite close. And so the decision will be, do I stick with my current car and buy a slightly more expensive fuel to put in it? Or do I scrap my car and go and buy something with an electric powertrain, which is more expensive to buy? And suddenly you then get to, it could be quite a close choice. And then from a policymaker's point of view, it's well, actually, should we be mandating one technology, or actually let the market compete and let consumers choose whichever is most suitable to them? So that would be my take on it. And I mean, what I would like to do, and I think this is a topic we could go into more detail now, but time is running away from it. We will invite you back.
Oh, I would love that. This has been great. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
Exactly. And, the politics of this are moving pretty fast at the moment.
They are. Every week there's a new story.
Yeah.
Some other country in Europe has just announced that they're going to be building a new reactor, or some other country has decided they want their first nuclear reactor. And all of the artificial intelligence data and the story about AI was breaking as I was writing this book. So much is happening in real time, which is really encouraging. And I actually felt way better having written this book than I did before about the future of the economy and our energy systems and the environment. So I hope readers leave with the same feeling.
Well, you allude to a really important point, which is the electricity planning that I see is predicated on certain demand projections, which are rapidly having to be rewritten because of the accelerating demand for AI. So that leaves, and that is likely to be prioritized by government as a source of economic growth.
Totally.
which could then leave transportation actually desperately short of renewable low carbon electricity unless it is plugged by nuclear. So, and those forecasts are being rewritten as we speak. So,
and who knows what's next? Nobody saw AI coming 5 years ago, and so all of those electricity projections from that time were underestimates. And that's one of the points why energy abundance is so important. You can't wait for the technology to come along and then think, oh no, we best build loads of energy infrastructure to support it, because it's too late then. You've lost the race. Someone else has got there first and become the world leader. You need to have that energy system there ready to go for the next technological advancement. And who knows what that's going to be next.
Yeah. And that's why I think Germany might be is going to be the real bellwether, because Germany its economic model is having to change so rapidly at the moment, not least, Oliver, because of the aftermath of Dieselgate and the plight of the internal combustion engine. How Germany reinvents its economic model is all to play for right now. So I think we should reconvene in 6 months' time, something like that, and see how things have changed rapidly. So
I would love that. We can have a recap.
On that note, I'm going to draw a close to now. But Oliver, as ever, thank you so much for your input. But Tim, thanks again. And and I would recommend to anyone listening to get hold of a copy of the book. It's a really refreshing read in the current environment. So thank you, Tim, and we will pick this up again another time. Thanks, everyone.
Super.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.